make scroll bowls, you know that one of the critical steps is the glue up of the rings. And if you've been doing this for a while, you've probably made some kind of a bowl press. This is a typical one, 10 inches in diameter, using 6-inch, 3/8-inch carriage bolts and 1/2-inch plywood. Beefier versions can be made using 3/4-inch plywood, using 8 instead of 6 carriage bolts, using threaded rod. There are all sorts of variations, but the principle is the same. You take your rings, these obviously have been glued, but if they've not, you stack them in here, you glue them, and then you put the top on and exert even pressure. And it's by far the best way to do gluing of this type. Now, one of the problems that's typically encountered is that the bowl will vary depending on how many rings you're gluing up. And if you have a lot of space, spinning the wing nuts gets to be very tedious. So one solution is typically used involves spacers. Sometimes these have holes drilled through this way to make them more versatile. But you insert the spacer, you put the wing nuts on, and you spin them, and then you tighten as you would a tire, a wheel, in sequence, skipping them so that you keep the even pressure on. Sometimes when I'm doing it, I hold it down in the center to prevent any tipping, which might unglue a surface that's being glued. This gets to be a nuisance. And to make it a little bit easier, one of my friends, a scroller and engineer named Dave Van Ness, who developed the site scrollmania.com, which has some wonderful utilities for bowl makers, including a program that lets you draw profiles and a little utility that lets you calculate the cutting angle. Well, he came up with some very nice clamps he calls quick clamps. These he made out of PVC, and they're drilled in such a way that you just slide them straight down as you would a spacer. But because of the way they're drilled, when you turn them, they tighten up and clamp down. And you can do it in sequence exactly as you would a spacer. These are easier to turn than wing nuts and lets you clamp and unclamp very easily. And when everything is done, you just lift them right off. I gave it a try, keeping it on overnight to see how well it maintained the pressure. And I discovered, to my delight, that the pressure was still there. Dave is currently working on another generation. These are PVC. The one that he's working on now is made of a plastic called acetal, which he thinks will give even more hold. And said that if you're interested in finding out more about these, contacted him through scrollmania.com. Right, now, the second tip I'm going to pass on to you in this video involves a technique using the same common materials you have around, the same clamps, but a new way or a strategy to solve a problem that often crops up and can take a project that's been going well and make it less than gorgeous in one unfortunate step. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a lovely box which used up the last of my precious ebony. So it was a very special project. And it looks fine. Glue up looks nice and tight. Until you turn to two of the faces and you see an ugly glue line. What had happened here was that I sanded it until it appeared to lie flat. And the easiest way to flatten your rings is to attach a piece of sandpaper, 120, 150 grit, something like that, to a flat surface. This was a big box store granite tile, and it works very nicely. And you selectively sand it until the rings sit flat, and if you shine a flashlight through it, you won't get any light, and that tells you it'll sit nicely. Sometimes the rings cooperate, and right after you cut them, they lie nice and flat, and you have very little to do except to clean off fuzzies. Sometimes they don't, because of stresses that are released during the cutting process, or perhaps the blank was not absolutely flat to begin with. And you sand them selectively and let them sit. However, when you've glued up several of the rings and are attaching the base, everything is rigid. You don't have a flexible ring, two flexible rings together that you can force. And despite your best efforts, you may not be able to get them to sit flat. If you can get them so that when you squeeze them, the gap will close, that tells you that you're pretty close. And I assumed with this, once I reached that stage, if I put it in the press, the pressure all around would force everything down. So I put it in, glued it up, and when I took it out, I found an ugly glue line. What had happened was that the pressure being even pushed down the higher sides, and where there was a dip, there was not enough pressure. So what I really needed was uneven pressure. The goal when you do a glue up is to get no visible seams between the rings like this, which gives you the illusion that this has been turned from a flat piece of wood. This, by the way, is one of my newer generation, more sculptured look bowls. And since I'm trying to emulate the look of something that was carved or turned from a solid piece of wood, a good tight glue up is really critical. Ugly lines completely destroy the illusion. Well, I was recently faced with a particularly problematic situation. This bowl is nearing completion. I have a little bit more sanding to do to tweak the upper ring, but it's essentially complete, and used a great deal of dyed black veneer, which is fairly expensive. A lot of veneer was used, and I had high hopes for this. And then I ran into a serious problem. This is what the blank looked like before I started cutting the rings out of it. One face had veneer on it. When I went to glue up rings, I found that the rings did not sit flat. Now, normally this is not a problem. You sand it away until it's flat. However, when you have veneer, the last thing you want to do is to sand away the veneer. You have a little bit that you can do that won't be noticed, but past a certain point, you've ruined your project. So I was caught, as they say, between a rock and a hard place. If I sanded more, I'd ruin it one way. If I glued it up, I'd ruin it another way because I wanted this to look absolutely tight. It's also used the last of my lovely redwood burl, so I really did not want to mess up this project. And it occurred to me that what I needed to do was to exert uneven pressure, to break a rule in order to get the right result. So I started out with my gluing using 2 rings. When you're in a difficult gluing situation, it's often wise, rather than gluing up several rings at a time, to do them 1 ring at a time. This may be if you're lining up a swag. In this case, I needed to line these up so that I would get the effect of a continuous line. 2 rings have flexibility, and I was able to glue it up, as you can see here, using the small vise that's attached to my workbench. I used a squeeze-type clamp to exert pressure in the area above the vise. When I closed the gap at the low spots, I was also forcing the rest of the ring together. After I sanded the rings, I found no spaces or visible glue lines, and the piece was smooth to the touch. When the bowl became too deep to clamp in the vise, I achieved the same results with a bowl press and 2 small shims This setup allowed me to exert uneven pressure on the problematic areas when the top of the press was clamped down. Again, after sanding, I found no visible glue lines or spaces. Although it was counterintuitive, in this case, even pressure will give you the wrong results. Selective application of uneven pressure will give you just what you need, and you'll end up with a bowl that comes out the way you want it. And the solution is ideal, particularly when you can't simply sand things away because of the limitations of the way you've glued up your blank. I hope that these 2 tips are helpful to you, both the new product, the quick clamps, and the new technique. And as I come across new ways of making the bowl making easier and letting you achieve better results, well, I'll just make another video to move you along with your own projects. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this helpful.